everyone, welcome back to Alkaline Hydroxide 784. And today in the GPO series, we will be looking at a topic that's not in the science but more of a different topic altogether. And this would be democracy. Well, you might be wondering why this sudden jump from two very science related topics to something that's probably not my niche. Well, because if I just kept covering science topics, there wouldn't be much of a variety. So, yeah. And I think at least I do have some knowledge about democracy compared to other things. Like, I'll definitely be more um, knowledgeable about this compared to something in sports format, for example. So, yeah, it's not so far off to assume that I could actually cover this. Now, and the thing is, like, I asked my cousin, so yeah, he suggested different aspects of politics or something. So I'm just gonna do this today, and it is one of the things that you actually do get in your reading thing, or at least when I got my reading notes 2 years ago, I did have this as part of the stuff that is covered. So I do remember seeing that there, and I think it's one of the topics that people actually want to know about. So yeah, at least since I do have the history background, I should have some amount of knowledge about this. Okay, cool. Let's start. So let's start with a definition of democracy, and that would be, if I'm gonna look at Merriam-Webster, it says democracy is government by the people, especially rule of the majority. Okay, this is quite important, rule of the majority, because that actually leads to one of the so-called problems with it as well. And the next one is what? Government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, blah blah blah. You get the idea. So in democracy, you have a government that allows the people to decide who is in the government and what they are supposed to be doing in a way. So that's the idea of democracy. So does true democracy exist where everything is decided by the people? I doubt so, because at least one thing is going to be decided by the people who are elected by the people. And there are some things that aren't voted by the people usually, even in a decently democratic nation. So the first thing we're going to look at is whether more democracy is better or is a semi-democracy better. So what am I talking about? Well, to before we actually get into that, let's actually see what kind of range of democracy exists. So if we go to the Democracy Index 2019, and as usual, since we live in Singapore, we should search for it, right? Oh wait, it's in like the 76th position. Oh well, nothing, not very surprising or anything. It's pretty expected. Singapore is actually considered a flawed democracy because, well, I think you kind of know why. Because the same party has been our main government since independence. More on that later, but technically in this index you can actually see which countries are supposedly the most democratic and which ones are the least democratic. And if you want to know more about the criteria and all that, you can go to the links and find them out for yourself. But actually the original source doesn't allow you to directly access the information. You need to put your name or something and then download their white paper. So there's another link which has the table there for you to see. I think it should be correct. The information should be correct because this is what linked me to the original source, so should be right. So you can refer to this if you want. Okay, anyways, now let me go into a few examples. I think actually I didn't really put the like the highest examples like Norway and Sweden. I didn't bother to talk about that, but I will talk about the so-called lower examples in terms of this ranking list. So before we go anywhere, let's start with Singapore itself. As I mentioned earlier, it is considered a flawed democracy. I mean, I don't really know why they call it flawed democracy. It's not like it's a bad thing. I mean, I'll tell you why it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a good thing in some ways. So I prefer using the term semi-democracy or like not super democracy, but somewhat democracy. It's not really a flaw in a way. But anyway, let's move on. That's not important. Um, so what's the reason behind it being termed as a flawed democracy? Because it's not entirely democratic in a way. I think we can like agree on that. And and the PAP is our main government since 50 years at least, which yes, is another fact. And it's hard for opposition to get the main spot as usual. Okay, cool. So how has the PAP managed to do that? Well, of course, the first strategy is being good. That's actually a good big reason because they're actually good and they do their job well. And yeah, that's probably the main reason why they've been there on the top spot forever. If the people like the current government, they'll just continue voting for it. I think that's pretty obvious. So second reason is maybe some due to the so-called gerrymandering they do every election. The slight changes in electoral boundaries. I'm not sure how much it really affects it though, but it probably helps them a bit. And they also kind of make it a little bit hard for the opposition to advertise themselves fully or express their opinions too publicly. The opposition can talk about stuff in the internal kind of meetings. Wait, what do they call them? The council and stuff like that. But in public, not so much. Yeah, so it's more like they bring up their opinions directly to the PAP. And yeah, there's another thing that probably happens is nearer to the GE, like they give those financial benefits to the less fortunate, right? So that tends to apparently happen more near the GE, but I'm not gonna try to prove it or anything. If you want, you can try to see if that's true or not. But anyway, the point is, for many reasons, because nothing really happens with just one reason, the PAP is been in power for pretty much all of Singapore's independence. And I don't think it's a bad thing, so I mean, you're doing well, kind of. So yeah, so what does this mean? Nothing much, honestly. I think apart from the direct politics part of it, in other senses of democracy, well, the people's opinions, are they respected by the government? Yes, to some extent, but not entirely. Like there are definitely some instances where the government is the one doing the stuff as well directly without having to really consult the entire population. And I think that's a good thing because yeah, it is sometimes a good thing because especially in scenarios like this, if we have a circuit breaker, for example, the government had to do the circuit breaker because people were not listening to the government. So obviously, you can't trust the people. You have to trust the government instead. Oh well. Anyways, but people do express their opinions still in places like Reddit because anonymity is quite helpful, and some of them do raise up pretty useful points while others just say it and then leave. I don't know. Okay, so now let's look at another country in Asia which supposedly more democratic, although this year it has also decreased quite a lot in the democracy index and somehow is lower than Malaysia now, so I have no idea how this happened. uh, but in my view, it would be technically considered democratic in structure, and that would be India. And of course, the problem with the democracy in India isn't really from the ruling party or stuff. Isn't really in terms of the structure itself, but the other things that actually affect it. And I suppose the reason why it's decreased in democracy is not because of the part of a party being in power for a very long time, but more from corruption, which is very rampant in India, and other things that lots of biases, people doing personal favors for other people, and things like that. And this is a very similar story to what we learn about in Southeast Asian nations as well, in history especially. Like, for example, we learn in H2 history that, in the past, I'm not sure if it's still the same now. I think it is to some extent. But in the Philippines, the elections were basically like a popularity contest. So, yeah, it's as terrible as that. It sounds a bit terrible, but at the same time, it's Well, that's the truth to some extent. And for India itself, it's more like, the party might buy more ballots, and there's also some kind of populism going on now and then, and there's other things that can affect the votes as well. So yeah, there's a reason why, even though it is technically democratic, it's not really the most democratic. So now let's go somewhere different where the countries are somewhat slightly more democratic than all the countries in Asia, and that would be Europe. Like Germany, France, that area. It's not really Norway or Sweden level yet, but it's just below that. The reason why I'm not mentioning the US is because honestly, you've seen how US works. We already know a lot about US. Let's not talk about it. Okay. So in terms of Europe, well, the Europe seems to be considered more democratic because there's a lot of things that they can do. They have this ability to have multi-party coalitions and stuff, so you can actually consider many permutations and stuff. And it allows the even the smaller parties to band together and somehow get into ruling power. And that in a way is considered democratic because compared to a system where only one party gets to rule at one point, you get many parties managing to rule, and the parties can keep changing every now and then. And yeah, it's pretty obvious in places like Germany and France especially. But yeah, there's a video on Germany's political structure, so if you want to know more about that, you can watch it, and you can see why it allows for a multi-party coalition. But the problem with this kind of structure is that it can be quite problematic, especially if you've heard enough about Brexit or something else that's more apparent. Basically, the thing about Australia changing PMs like a gazillion times in the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah, that kind of thing happens. So that can cause a lot of trouble for a country that allows this to happen. And there won't, and in a way, sometimes the party never really, no single party gets like the full, the main majority of the seats. It's not very, they don't really have a full enough control of the, like, enough part of the pie in order to really stay for a decent amount of time. They immediately come and then they go. Sometimes that happens. So yeah, and in a way, these countries might be more prone to populism just because people can easily, like, just be like, oh, I don't like this current party, and then they can just have another election, and then things will just keep changing. So this what's the conclusion from all of this? Well, it might be possible to say that maybe more democracy is not always good because it can lead to instability. So you might have to be a bit careful when you are increasing the amount of, like, possibilities in your democratic regime. And if you look at early Southeast Asia, there were some countries that attempted to do democracy, but they ended up failing miserably, and it became like more of an authoritarian regime at the end of the day because all the democratic governments kind of just failed, and they never really had enough cohesion within themselves because of the different parties, as well as the fact that they were quite unstable. They never really lasted long enough to do anything worthwhile. So yeah, that's pretty much what you can conclude from this. So another reason why instability is bad is because it leads to instability in another very important thing, the economy. So the truth is, if you remember history, and or if you okay, I guess if you don't study history, you might not really know this, but in terms of Southeast Asian history, we do know that we've seen that when there's either a somewhat authoritarian government, or if it's a semi-democracy and there's one government who's in in control most of the time, we usually get more economic prosperity in a sense. And that's even true for the authoritarian one. So in fact, having one person who is stably ruling the entire, like, the country for a decent amount of time tends to help in terms of the prosperity. But of course, it doesn't apply to all countries, and the person in charge must be clever enough to not end up messing up And in the case of Indonesia and the Philippines, they eventually messed up because they were obviously not, like, they were obviously following stuff like cronyism, corruption, stuff like that. So in the end, even though there's a lot of economic prosperity, after a while it just failed big time. Whereas for a semi-democracy, it kind of worked because the part, like, it's not one person ruling everything, but more like a party, like a group of people who know what they want to do, and they are interested in the interests of the country. Yeah, I think that would probably help to see just how much democracy you really need for the country to properly succeed. But that doesn't mean that you cannot succeed without if you're too democratic, or you cannot succeed if you're authoritarian either. There's probably success stories in all of the three, conditions. Like, for example, Vietnam is decently doing well, even though they're somewhat like not sure if they're considered communist. Yeah, they have like a communist kind of a party, and they're doing quite well for whatever that, like, they have a decent amount of progress, and they're quite adaptive too. So it's not necessary that you need democracy to succeed, and at the same time, it's not necessary that democracy will cause problems. It really depends on many things as well, and also on, like, different contexts of each country. So do take note of this when you're, making arguments related to democracy. Okay, so let's move on. So now let's look at another issue that can occur in terms of democracy, and that would be the majority minority divide. Okay, so it can be quite, the point of democracy is to listen to the opinion of the majority. At that point of In that sense, it seems okay, but there's some problems with this. The first one is herd mentality, where there'll be some people who just vote along with other people just because everyone else is voting in favor of a certain outcome. And that means that they aren't really thinking about the consequences, or they aren't thinking about the big picture of what would happen if they vote for this particular outcome. So it it could be like either they really aren't even thinking about it, or it could be like they know one of the things and they already made a decision based on one aspect instead of the entire thing, kind of a thing. So yeah, it's a bit messy. That's why there's always disputes when certain outcomes that really happen due to a very small difference in the margin, like 51 to 49, that kind of margin, or if there's a significant minority, then it can be quite a problem. And if you want an example of herd mentality that is truly just herd mentality and not even thinking, you can look at the UN. I mean, not even looking at the country itself, but the entire UN. Yay, history. Thanks for this important content that we need. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah, this why, in a way, maybe you don't have to study as much for your GP. You can just use all the stuff from history and and then just do your GP essay. Okay, anyways, so in the UN, the thing is, the UN was always a mess. Let's just say that. But at the beginning of the UN's formation, a lot of the countries were US supporters, or at least US supporters, like, because they're all the Western European countries. And after a while, a lot of the poorer countries joined from Africa and from Asia, and a lot of them decided to support the USSR, or at least they just made their own bloc of countries, and they always voted for their issues instead. Why is there always some construction noise in each room? Why? Okay, anyway, that's not important. Okay, so the so the poorer countries tended to vote towards either Soviet-based opinions or for their own issues, in a sense, and totally ignored the Western European and US, in that sense. And in these two phases of history, it's like all of the things that were going on were heavily favored towards one side, and this is quite unfair for the other side, just because a lot of especially in the 60s, when all the poor countries joined, it kind of had this like, they just anyhow decided to follow all the other poor countries, in a sense, and it led to a lot of problems, and some of the richer countries weren't exactly excited about having to give money to the UN just to end up with all the decisions being made by the majority, aka all the poor countries, because there's a lot of them. So yeah, this is quite a big deal, and it can have a big repercussion even in, especially in places like the UN. But I think nowadays is a little bit better because everyone has come to their senses, hopefully, or not. I don't know. At least some of them would have come to their senses by now. But it led to a lot of problems within the UN, and it made it pretty inefficient in a sense. So next, okay, so a second problem about the majority and minority thing is the majority winning over the minority. You might think, okay, this is the point of democracy, right? The point is to choose the majority's opinion. But the problem is, if it was just simply the opinion, it might be okay. Like the only difference between the majority and the minority was the opinion is okay. But most of the times, the difference in opinion is also due to the differences between the majority and minority itself, like in terms of racial differences or societal differences, like rich versus poor or middle class or whatever that is, or any other way that you can possibly divide people. It's very hard to, you very rarely get a scenario where they're only divided in terms of opinions. And there's many ways that you can be a majority or a minority of anything, given that today we literally know about all kinds of issues, all kinds of different groups of people who can be affected by many different issues. And if most of the time the minority is actually big enough to feel like decently oppressed or negatively affected by the democracy. And since they're quite a big minority, it is going to be an issue because a decent amount of people in your population is affected by the decision, even though they didn't, and they themselves didn't want to choose the decision, but it happened because of the majority. So would it be better then to take into account the minority and not be too democratic per se, and instead have like a compromised kind of decision that helps both of them at the same time, doesn't negatively affect one of the groups? So what I mean, like have a third party who knows the needs of both groups decide for them, instead of having people vote in a sense. Because if they were to vote, you would just get the majority's desire and not the minorities. But if you take into consideration both groups' wants and needs and stuff like that, then you can make a decision that would be accepted by most, if not all, the people. And in that sense, maybe democracy isn't a good idea, but more of intelligence. Just having somebody who is well versed with the entire realm of society making a decision would be a better option, and someone who doesn't have like biases between, like, towards any of the groups in a sense. So the third reason why it can be a problem is because people are can be stupid and generally people tend to think individually. Like, think about it, it's just human nature. You think about yourself for sure before you even think about other people mostly. But and it's also easier to think individually because that's what you're most familiar with compared to the entire country. Like, you're not gonna think about what your name, like, even if at most you probably might think about your friends or people who you know, but that's not really the entire country. So definitely everyone has biases, and if they vote with that bias, it could lead to a ultimately biased or flawed result, which doesn't help in the end, which is actually not what will help the people. It's kind of like how in this in this period of time, the government knows what's the best thing to do, which is to have this circuit breaker. But people are obviously, there are definitely some people who disregarded it, and then now the government has to make it even more, more intense of a circuit breaker. Just because you can't trust the people, you end up having to trust the government instead. So in terms of such cases, it's better to trust the government because at least they have more intelligent people. Yeah, that's pretty much that's pretty much the point. It's kind of related to the second point as well. It's like kind of having the third party who knows more about how the people will react and what the actual impact of whatever outcome that's going to happen. Okay, so the final issue would be about whether democracy is degrading. So the first thing we can look at is maybe populism, whether populism actually affects democracy. So the idea of populism is when maybe there's like one government and they didn't really do so well, or like economic regression or some problem happens, and then people suddenly start being angry about it and they're like, we need a change in government, so whoever comes at the time is just gonna get elected. That's how you get people like Trump elected, because it was just the right timing to get elected. Oh well. Okay, I'm not sure if that's exactly the reason why he was elected, because it's more of because of the way the US system works, and somehow it allowed him to become the president instead of Hillary Clinton. So yeah, I'm not sure how this works. Anyways, but it's not only in America that populism is quite a thing. It's also there in many countries in Europe. I mentioned earlier about the frequent changing of governments and stuff that could be a problem there. Yeah, this could be one of the reasons why that happens too. So there are some links on whether populism affects democracy or not. So you can read them on your own time, because I'm not familiar with that part of it. I'm a bit lazy to actually go and read the entire article and figure out what it says. So just read it yourself. If you want, you can use it. It's not really that important. It might not really be that important for what your purpose is. Okay, so, or if you're more interested in knowing what it means for democracy to degrade itself, you can, or look at different reasons why that could happen. You can go and see this Wikipedia link. I think it seems like a pretty decent summary of why it could happen, like corruption, populism, other reasons. Basically, maybe the government losing trust in the people, stuff like that. So yeah, but I'm gonna tell you about one thing, which is about Venezuela. Why basically Venezuela went through populism, which eventually led to authoritarianism. The reason why I'm gonna look at this instead of Southeast Asia is because I want variety, and I also want to know about it. So yeah, so I actually bothered to look through this article a little bit. So the leader in Venezuela, Mr. Chavez, he got into power through populism. So people were a bit annoyed. This was like at least 20 years ago. So yeah, it's a very long time ago. So he got into power through populism. And once he gets into power, things are much easier for him, right? So it soon became authoritarian. So he fired the people who he didn't like, and then he soon got control of the national oil company, or disabling labor unions and stuff like that. Wait a minute, why does it sound like Indonesia? Oh well. Anyways, yeah, if you know your Southeast Asian history, it does sound a bit like what Southeast Asian some of the people who were somewhat authoritarian, or at least got most of the power in Southeast Asia in the past, kind of did. Yeah, so it sounds a bit like Indonesia when Suharto got into power. But unlike Indonesia, Venezuela didn't have much of any economic success. They were already doomed from the get-go, so it led to a crisis in Venezuela. So you can look at the links for that, I guess. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's about it. I think this is actually pretty interesting. And I don't end up spending a lot of time talking about the definition of democracy, and instead talk about the issues more directly. Because for a science topic, I would be very into telling how the thing works and all that, because I'm invested in it. But this is a bit less likely for me to go and tell you how democracy works, because you already know how it works to some extent, and I don't really have anything extra to add. So yeah. So if you want more arguments about this, you can refer to the Britannica link. I think there seems to be a lot of stuff that you can read there, so it might help you with your general arguments, and then from there you can search for evidences or stuff like that. Yeah, I think that's about it. I hope you find this episode useful. If despite me actually spending more time on the actual issues, it still felt like too much time, then you can tell me. But at least it is within 30 minutes. And yeah, so if you found this video useful, please press the like button and subscribe. And with that, I would like to say thank you and bye.